Welcome back to an obscure tour at the edge of the internet. I am your host, the Nameless Tour Guide, and as you can see, I've put on some clothes today as we are heading down to a place where you need to have some protection from the sickness, Blighttown. And as we are heading down, we will be discussing those enigmatic sisters that we saw in the opening cutscene following the Witch of Izalith around, the Daughters of Chaos. Also, we'll be chatting with Laurentius and Knight Lautrec and seeing New Londo for the first time. The last time we talked about the Daughters of Chaos, we were on the road to the Capra Demon in the basement. 8 wily bandits attempted to slit our throats, with black dogs that were half eaten away by their side. 8 wily bandits, 8 statues of women with flaming staves, connecting them to the magics we saw in the opening cutscene. 8 because there are 8 Daughters of Chaos. Now, I'm sure when I mentioned that many episodes ago, a lot of people jumped off this obscure tour the moment that I mentioned such an idea. Why listen to me when I can't even count? In the opening cutscene, there are clearly 7 Daughters of Chaos with the Witch of Izalith, not 8. And that is a very fair point. But this contradiction is key to many things. Why are there 7 Daughters of Chaos in the opening cutscene when there are 8 statues here? These statues have flaming staves, and the simplest explanation for these staves is they are representing the Daughters of Chaos. But there are 7, but there are 8. The numbers that represent the Daughters of Chaos are somewhat chaotic. As we discussed when we first came into the Undead Church, these statues are part of a progression through time. At the beginning of the First Age of Fire, there was no need for the Undead Church, as Fireling Shrine was where the Witch of Izalith, along with her daughters, tended to the flame. This is represented by the statue of the Witch of Izalith holding a child. In that time, Nito, assisted by Velka and Priscilla, harvested the dead for their humanity, and it was taken to Fireling Shrine, where it was burnt as fuel, continuing the cycle of life and death that is represented by the flame. Then Gwyn married Priscilla, upsetting Nito and the balance of the world, and at that point the Undead Church was built as a place to harvest humanity, but all that was needed at that time was the altar with the cattle and sheep. The humanity for the flame no longer came from the dead, but the noble knights of Astora. Then there is the Second Age of Fire, where Gwyn destroys Astora, betraying Priscilla and Velka, builds New Londo, and sacrifices himself to the flame with the rite of kindling in an attempt to keep the dark at bay. But all the flames must fade, and the first flame fades again. At this point, the Witch of Izalith created a whole new flame, a flame free of Gwyn's influence, and one that would return balance to the world. And that was when these statues were created and placed here. The symbols moved from the sheep and cattle representing those harvested, to the doves and boars representing the new piece of the new flame. The flame of the Witch of Izalith, which I personally call the Children's Flame, becomes known as the Flame of Chaos, and after a series of tragedies it leads to the creation of Priscilla's utopia of Ulasil, where everyone will finally get along, or else. Moving on to the target shield and the 5 circles on it, focusing just on the outer circles. There are 4. The number 4 appears in a few places in Dark Souls lore, and this is one of those things like the Ring of the Dark Eye where I believe there is more going on than I have figured out so far. There are 4 souls and 4 lords. There are 4 great leaders of New Londo. There are 4 flames, the first, the Chaos Flame, and 2 more that we'll come to after those. There are 4 generals of Gwyn, Manus, Havel the Rock, the firstborn of Gwyn, and Hawkeye, which is a character we haven't met yet, but he was a leader in Gwyn's army during the battle with the dragons. There are also 4 great cities, Astora, Izalith, New Londo, and Ulasil. But what I've settled upon for the moment is that these points represent the points on the compass, and more specifically the lands of Lordran that are associated with them. The Eastern Land is the most prominent in Dark Souls 1. It's made up of Astora, Blighttown that we will be seeing today, and Lost Izalith. The West is also in the game. That is the Darkroot Garden in the Darkroot Basin, the ruins of Ulasil. There is also a nod towards a frozen northern land with the Northern Undead Asylum. And to the south, even though it is never mentioned that it is south, is the Duke's Archives, the realm of Seath the Scaleless. Though the south could also be simply a place that is not specified, there are places such as Carim, Thurland, the Great Swamp. None of these are given a place on the map in Dark Souls 1, and they could be what makes up an unknown southern land. And the reason I settled on this is because the Daughters of Chaos are all about chaos, of course, and the perfect source of chaos is a perpetual war between 4 rival states, and we'll be returning to that idea later in this episode. And now the center circle. If you look closely, hopefully you can see the 8-pointed star with a circular center. It's a bit hard with the background pattern, but there are 2 points at the bottom of the circle that are the clearest, and then you can follow the shape around to the left. Notice that one of the points of the star is missing. Just to the right of those 2 points at the bottom, one of the points of the star has a dark spot in the middle of it. A point is missing. 7 points with 1 missing. This is what we see in the opening cutscene with the Daughters of Chaos as well. When the daughters are weaving their firestorms, one daughter is positioned too far to the left, leaving an obvious gap where something should be. When the witches are in their coven, the Witch of Izalith is looking at an empty space across from her. It's a continuation of the idea of 7, but also 8. And finally, notice the design of the 4 outer protrusions that are designed like female breasts, the tops being the nipples and the base being a frill-like design, like a dress that is supposed to expose the breast. We will come across this same frill design when we meet a male character called Smo, the Executioner. But these female breasts are important symbols of the Daughters of Chaos. And just a quick note about the tour and this episode is that we will be getting into some adult-orientated material. Until now, I've been able to leave that imagery up to you at home to notice for yourself, but in this episode and in a few episodes in the future, there's no avoiding it, so I'll just be discussing it directly. And now, as we finish up the section in the Undead Church, notice the staff that represents the fire sorcery of the Daughters of Chaos. At the very top, we see pegs. And if we count those pegs, we see that there are 7. There could have been any number of pegs. It could have been a hexagon with 6 pegs or an octagon with 8 pegs. But the designer chose specifically to put 7 pegs at the top of this staff. 7 pegs on 8 staves. Out here in the courtyard, we can see a tower that seems to be knocked over with the top removed, as though there was once a second bell tower here. And this destroyed tower is near the symbols of Seath the Scaleless, as we discussed a few episodes ago, connecting the Pale Drake to this tower. The second bell that is missing from the tower is the one we are searching for today, one that was taken from the Undead Parish and moved far below to Blighttown when the trials of the pilgrimage were changed by Seath the Scaleless and the Daughters of Chaos. Now recall from many episodes ago, Seath the Scaleless became the head of the Way of White. He inherited it after Ulasil fell, and he inherited it from Priscilla. At this point, all the great cities have fallen: Astora, Izalith, New Londo, and Ulasil, and Seath the Scaleless and the Daughters of Chaos are left with the writhing ruin of Lordran. And now to the elevator and a different alliance involving the Daughters of Chaos. Notice the tiles that decorate the floor of the elevator. Notice the center tile first. The decoration is hard to see again because of the extra detail, but in the center we see 5 circles, 1 in the middle, 4 on the outside, just like the target shield, a symbol of the Daughters of Chaos. Around the outside we see 10 rectangular tiles. The floral pattern in it is very important, as it is a symbol of the Way of White and how it changes over time. We'll see this symbol in Enolondo, in Gwyn's tomb, and finally in the city of Ulasil, as well as here in the Undead Church. This shows the influence of Gwyn, and here it shows a direct connection between the Way of White and the Daughters of Chaos. This elevator shows the Daughters of Chaos and Gwyn coming together to form an alliance to keep the fire lit during the Age of Astora, the elevator being used to move the dark harvested from the Undead Church to the first flame below in Fireling Shrine. Hopefully this isn't too confusing. I struggle with how to explain this, but the Daughters of Chaos represent what is needed to feed the flame, for the light and the dark to exist, for the balance of the world to continue. This may seem strange because in most fictions, chaos is usually part of the destruction of the world, and order is what keeps the world sane. But in Lordran, the balance of the world is kept by its churn, by its disparity, and the Witch of Izalith understood this, and that is why she sits between Nito of the Dark and Gwyn of the Light. And her daughters represent the chaos between those two aspects, the thing that is needed to keep Lordran in balance. Then why did the daughters, who represent chaos, move away from the Witch of Izalith and towards Gwyn, a creature of pure light? It was all part of Gwyn's master plan, and we will be talking about that as we head down into Blighttown. Right now, let's talk about that symbol of menace, Laurentius of the Great Swamp.
Well, I see you made it out. Yeah, I made it out safely too. I have my pyromancy of the Great Swamp, so I can usually manage with a bit of care. Oh yeah, by the way, I can share my spells with you. I think you have a knack for it. All you need are the materials. I'd be pleased to help you. Unless you find the magics unsavory.
Laurentius is a pyromancer, which is another class of magic, different from sorcery and from miracles we have seen so far, and the differences between the three are important. Unlike Griggs with his sorceries, who tells us we need to acquire a catalyst first, or miracles that are bound to covenants and talismans, here Laurentius is able to give us everything we need if we simply consent.
Oh really? Well, that's a shame. But it's your choice. I'm on the fringe. Yeah, I know. Undead or not, that's who I am. I only wish that I could have repaid you somehow.
We have rejected the offer of materials, and Laurentius is then magnanimous enough to admit he is on the fringe of society, and he only wishes he could have repaid us for saving him from the depths. We have seen many faces of menace so far: Andre of Astora, Vermoose in the Catacombs, and now Laurentius. But there is another face to menace, the Father of the Abyss, and he is, in my opinion, one of the toughest bosses in the game. And that is important to remember about Menace, is he is a nice guy like Andre of Astora, but he can be a real jerk when it suits him. And Laurentius here is that middle ground of Menace, the charming con man. Though this is a long con, and we won't see what Laurentius is really up to until later in the tour.
Oh, hello there. I'm pleased to see you safe. Oh, and if by chance you've had a change of hearts, I'll be pleased to assist you by sharing my spells. Yeah, wonderful. I'm sure that they'll be of some use, some assistance. Here, first take this.
And so the consent has been given and the materials have been exchanged, the pyromancy flame. And now that we have this pyromancy flame, we will be able to cast the pyromancy spells of the Great Swamp and everywhere else.
A flame from the Great Swamp. Now you're a fully fledged pyromancer. Why, let's get started right now.
And this is the difference between pyromancy, sorcery, and miracles. Miracles require us to bar up a cleric or a lord to have access to them, and barring a few exceptions, each miracle has faith requirements which must be met in order to cast them. Sorceries require a catalyst and a teacher, and we did not see this, but Griggs and eventually Big Hat Logan will not talk to us unless we have a certain level of intelligence. Without that intelligence, we are seen as someone who cannot understand the sorcerers and their ways, and we are dismissed with just a few simple lines of dialogue. The sorceries themselves also have an intelligence requirement that must be met. This is not the case for pyromancy. All you need is someone who is willing to give you the required materials and then teach you the pyromancies. An undead who has been reinforced in any way can use pyromancy, and every pyromancer is happy to provide you with the materials you need. Pyromancy is magic and power for the everyman. And now let's look at these pyromancies: Iron Flesh and Flash Sweat. These are two things associated with blacksmiths, and also a progression of menace, starting with bronze to brass to iron. These here are extra clues to the symbolic nature of Laurentius of the Great Swamp. And it's important to note that these two miracles are only available from Laurentius. We will be meeting other pyromancers during our hero's journey, but they will not have access to these two pyromancies. The others are available from them. Pyromancy of Carmina, who harnessed the power of flame to actualize the inner self. Iron flesh boosts defense and resilience. Use of this pyromancy requires caution as the caster becomes extremely heavy and unable to move freely. And the thing to note about Iron Flesh here is that it makes the caster extremely heavy. This is linked to an idea we saw in the catacombs, the Mask of the Valiant Father, an item that increases weight load so that the undead can carry heavier items. This brings together the idea of heaviness, fatherhood, iron, blacksmithing, pyromancy, and Menace, who becomes known as the Father of the Abyss. And notice that Carmina helped harness the power of the flame to actualize the inner self, just what pyromancy represents, power and magic for the everyman. Flash Sweat, pyromancy of Carmina, who harnessed the power of flame to actualize the inner self. Intense sweating reduces flame damage. Carmina, the most accomplished pupil of Salaman the Master Pyromancer, pioneered new directions for the art of pyromancy. Flash Sweat is another hint towards the link between blacksmithing and Laurentius. Of course, as blacksmiths work at their anvil and in front of their fire, they are protected by the sweat that they give off. This pyromancy also starts to chronicle the history of pyromancy. Salaman, the Master Pyromancer, was the first person to learn pyromancy outside of a select group. This was in the era when pyromancy was a secretive art form kept from the world. But after Salaman learnt it, he taught others, and the art form spread in the Great Swamp amongst his followers. One of those followers being Carmina, who took pyromancy in a completely new and unexpected direction. And while we are here, we will enhance the power of the pyromancy flame. Notice the word here, ascend, not reinforce. We are changing the fundamental nature of the pyromancy flame, and we are doing so by giving it our life force, the souls we have acquired.
Goodbye then. Come back if you find anything new.
Notice Laurentius wants us to return if we find anything new. This is a nod to his own personal questline, but also to the nature of Menace as a great creator. Menace always wanted to know about new things. The flame, the lords, the dark, it all excited and inspired Menace to create. And now let's talk to Laurentius and see what he has to say.
Pyromancy is the art of casting fire. Produce flame, then channel it, just as our ancestors did. A pyromancer must be in tune with nature herself. My home, the Great Swamp, is an abundant store of nature. You will understand one day. It only takes time.
What Laurentius is describing here is the fact that the flame is nature itself, and to harness that elementary power, one needs to understand the balance the flame represents. Notice the term ancestors. The age of Salaman is actually quite recent compared to other events. This is a nod to the idea that the Daughters of Chaos are part of the bloodline that makes up the race of smaller humanoids.
Pyromancy has a, well, rather primitive aspect to it. It meshes poorly with advanced culture, and pyromancers are considered rather unsavoury, which is fine, as I never got along with anybody anyway. So, for me, turning undead didn't change a thing.
There are a few things here. First, Laurentius notes the interaction between the primitive nature of the fire and advanced civilization. This is firstly a reference to Manus, who is said to be a primitive man later in the game, and he was around in the Age of the Ancients, and may have been there even when the first flame was found in the dark. And also it foreshadows what happened to Manus. He was a person who revered the fire, but he was also a great engineer. He was the major civilizing force behind Lordran, building all 4 of the great cities. but the two forces did not mesh well together, and that is why we see the Titanite demon thrashing around in the symbolic ruins of Astora in the old church in the woods.
The pyromancer's flame is a part of his own body. The flame develops right along with his skill. When I gave you that flame, I gave you a part of myself. Please take good care of it.
Notice the sincerity suddenly being expressed by the actor in that line of dialogue. The flame is important, not just to you, but to the one who gave it to you. It is part of them, and when they give it to you, they are giving you part of themselves. And just returning to the idea of the fringe and being an outsider, which was a reoccurring theme in that dialogue. Menace was an outsider. He was a great engineer in a race of primitive men. He was a man who lived in Enolondo, the city of gods. And that is what was being shown in the old church in the woods. In the early days of the first age of fire, there was only the first 2 levels, as nothing else existed. That church was where Menace was worshipped as a living god, a link between the world below and whatever predated Enolondo high above. And just here, notice the design of the pyromancy. See how I throw it? See the design of the flame. This will be important later on. Now, returning to the idea of being an outsider. Astora was meant to be a home for Menace, a place where he could belong, where he would be with someone who was equally as brilliant as him, Velka, another outsider. But it was not his city, it was Velka's city, and there he was a small humanoid figure who was referred to as the Dragon King. Menace never belonged anywhere, and no matter how helpful, gentle, kind, or belligerent Menace seems, he is always alone and he's always on the fringe. And now leaving Laurentius and returning to that symbol of Gwyn, Knight Lautrec of Carim.
Oh, hello. I'm considering a change of location. I have a rather pressing matter to attend to up above. That keeper has served me well, but enough with her.
Sadly, Knight Lautrec will be leaving us soon, and so to celebrate his short time with us, let's recap the clues we have found surrounding him and Velka's mystery. We found him in the Undead Church, locked away by the mystery key. A key which we found in the mess hall where those that remained feasted upon the fools with too much humanity. Lautrec helped us out in the ruins of Astora in the battle with a gaping dragon, and would have helped us ring the bell of awakening if we had done the fights in a different order, an act which is a symbol of community and fellowship and also shows the way to Enolondo. He is from Carim, a place that has become associated with Velka and the Dark Moon Blades, and he may even be one of them. He gave us the Sunlight Medallion, an item associated with the followers of the firstborn of Gwyn, the Sunlight Warriors, but his summoning sign is white. He only belongs to the Way of White. And now we know he knew the Martyr, the firekeeper who is bound to this place to keep the fire lit, and she has served him well. But now sadly Knight Lautrec no longer requires her service, and he will be moving above, perhaps to Enolondo. And there are 2 pieces of dialogue that I would just like to cover now, one which refers to Trusty Patches and the other that refers to Petrus of Tharaland. We missed these dialogues because we took Knight Lautrec to the Gaping Dragon battle so early on. Lautrec stops helping after the Gaping Dragon battle or the Bell of Awakening is rung. Both of these actions are significant to the knight and are part of his work. The dialogue about Trusty Patches is about how Patches rubs Lautrec the wrong way, and if Lautrec ever sees him again, Patches will lose his hide. This is a reference to Gwyn and Nito's falling out, and why Nito stays in the catacombs, as Gwyn is willing to have Nito's hide if he sees him again. This is also an extra piece of detail. Trusty Patches was once a knight of the Way of White. We'll see evidence of this later. And before he became an outcast from that order, he knew Knight Lautrec of Carim. And then we have the dialogue about Petrus of Tharaland. Petrus has returned. We saw him quickly at the bottom of the stairs. He has abandoned Rhea in the catacombs, just as Sif did to Priscilla. Sif was meant to live below with Nito when he took Priscilla away from Enolondo. But Sif could not handle the dark of the catacombs, and he went running back to Gwyn and his light. And when he did, he was mocked by Gwyn, because Gwyn knew it would all happen. Gwyn is no fool, and he knows everyone's weaknesses, and he exploits them. Why? For their own good, of course. Notice the use of the term old man referring to Sif's age, and also notice that his robes and trinkets won't help him now. Gwyn knows that now Priscilla is his for the taking. Because Sif's core mistake was the fact that he took her away from Havel the Rock, a person who could protect her. But why did Sif flee the catacombs? This is best explained in a bit of dialogue from Vince of Tharilan that we missed, but we will discuss in detail later when we meet Gwendolyn. Vince says an important phrase, Verionox, which is Latin for fear the night. Gwendolyn fears the night, and so does his grandfather Sif the Scaleless. Sif lived in the long dark of the everlasting dragons, and ever since Sif has feared the night, as he had to live in a true age of dark, not the one that comes from the flames waxing and waning, but an existence of pure and endless nothing. And this existence terrifies him. And this is the same nothing that is promised by Priscilla's blue tears, an endless ocean where the undead are left to float alone for eternity. That is why the gods fear Life Hunt. And now to another elevator, and you may have already noticed the same circular pattern we saw above in the Undead Church, linking this elevator to the Daughters of Chaos. And this elevator is one of the few things that is repeated across Lordran. There is an elevator here, one in the center of New Londo, and another in the Darkroot Basin. This shows the Daughters of Chaos were revered across all the lands of Lordran. And now we have 8 women standing in a circle. Each woman has an outstretched arm, just like the statues above in the Undead Church. But these statues are rather rough, as though they were carved in a simpler time, in the time when the statuette Fireling Shrine was created. This is one of the first depictions of the Daughters of Chaos, and it was created early in the First Age of Fire, after the dragons were defeated. And there are 8 of them. And not only that, there are 2 women larger than the rest. This did not happen in the opening cutscene. There we had 7 Daughters of Chaos, and they were all of equal size. This is another infuriating contradiction that we will have to resolve. But now let's have a look at the end of Gwyn's legacy, the ruins of New Londo, the great undead city. This is the ruins of New Londo, and it was ruled by 4 great leaders: Manus the blacksmith deity, Havel the Rock, the firstborn of Gwyn, and the Dark Sun, Gwendolyn. And now that we have discussed the nature of Priscilla, we know that it was destroyed by her blue tears. And there's one more interesting piece of detail that I would just like to show before we leave the ruins of New Londo. Up here on this building, we can see the Elder Futhark Room of Algiz, the symbol of divine protection. New Londo was meant to be the city that broke the cycle of the soul and humanity, that took the vision of the great Lord of Sunlight Gwyn and created a world where there was no dark. New Londo was meant to be the place where man came to finally conquer the dark that was inherently within them. And now we will head up to the Valley of the Drakes. Notice this pot. It is the type of pot which Rhea of Tharilan prays in front of in Fireling's Shrine. These water vessels are symbols of Priscilla. Notice they are empty. They could be empty for technical reasons. The developers didn't want to deal with water effects, but it could also be a symbol of Priscilla's rejection of her duty to keep the gods of Lordran in check. And it is here to mark the entrance to the Valley of the Drakes, a collection of symbols of Priscilla and her children. And now quickly, here we are in the east, and here we see a sun. Is it dusk or is it dawn? This is important to think about, as it reminds us we are not on Earth. Where does the sun set in Lordran? Does it even set at all? What are the natural laws that govern Lordran? Well, all the suns are illusions, so who knows anymore? But there are natural laws governing this world, and they are key to getting to the bottom of its mysteries.